Dares to light the traditional Kuttuvalakku, signifying the auspicious start. Thank you. We call on Mr. Vellayan, Trustee Vellayan Chettiar Trust, to formally welcome the gathering.
Professor Belmaker, Uncle Mr. Murugappan, Dr. Mahesh, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Vellayan Chettiar Trust, I would like to welcome all of you to this 14th MB Arunachalam Endowment Oration. And I thank you all for responding to our invitation. The MB Arunachalam Center for Information and Education is part of the VHS complex, and for the last 15 years, both Dr. Krishnamurthy Srinivas and Dr. Mahesh, with their team, have been rendering yeoman's service to people with psychiatric disorders. The center has pioneered the concept of information delivery in neurology through trained counselors and professionals. The primary focus initially was for disorders such as epilepsy, dementia, and psychosomatic conditions. A website for treatment of epilepsy and even for caregivers manual was put together as part of the early efforts. Subsequently, the center has gone on to provide a more comprehensive counseling service for a range of neuropsychiatric disorders. Today, it has social workers helping and rendering both individual and family interventions to disadvantaged people. All these services are provided free or at very minimal cost with the help of the foundation. This annual lecture, organized by Dr. Mahesh in the memory of my late father, Mr. M.B. Arunachalam, could not have found a more appropriate topic to perpetuate his memory, as father always had a very inquisitive mind. The topic of today's oration, "Why do children turn out the way they do?" is topmost on the mind of all parents, to-be parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents. And today we are privileged to have with us Professor Belmaker, who is actually the president of the International Neuropsychiatry Association. He comes from Israel, and he will deliver the lecture. I would like you to give a very warm welcome to Professor Belmaker and his wife who are here with us today. Briefly, by way of introduction, Dr. Belmaker received his BA from Harvard in '67 and his MD from the Duke Medical School in '71. He was a clinical associate at the National Institute of Mental Health at Bethesda, after which he's held a number of important positions in Jerusalem Health Center and at the Ben Gurion University in Israel. Mr. Belmaker was a pioneer in biological psychiatry in Israel and chaired the International College of Neuropsychopharmacology meeting in Jerusalem in '82. His research interests include affective disorders, especially mania, ECT, second messenger mechanisms. And he has come out with a host of papers, and he's been awarded a number of prizes over the year. But I think the most important is that in 2015, he became the president of the Israeli Psychiatric Association, and since 15 has also been the president of the International Neuropsychiatric Association. He has published over 400 articles and edited about 18 books. He served a term of 10 years as chairman of his Department of Psychiatry and as director of the Mental Health Center in Beer Sheva. He was the psychiatric hospital representative of the Soroka Hospital in Helsinki and member of the Clinical Trials Committee of the Ministry of Health in Israel. Throughout all this, he has not lost touch with clinical medicine, and in addition to being an inpatient unit head till 94, he opened a public bipolar disorder clinic 40 years ago and continues to now see patients weekly at the bipolar clinic in Jerusalem. Today, Professor Belmaker will speak to us and enlighten us on this interesting subject of why do children turn out the way they do. I have pleasure in presenting you Professor Belmaker.
Thank you, Mr. Velayan. We request Mr. M.B. Murugappan, Trustee Velayan Chettiar Trust, to present the 14th M.B. Arunachalam Endowment Award and the traditional Ponnade. Thank you, sir. We call on Professor R.H Belmaker to deliver the 14th M.B. Arunachalam Endowment Oration on Why Do Children Turn Out the Way They Do? A Neuropsychiatric Viewpoint.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here in India and really appreciate Mr. Velayan and Mr. Murugappan's support over the years of medicine in general in Chennai. I spoke with Mr. Velayan last night and understood some of his activities, and support of neuropsychiatry in particular. And want to thank Dr. Krishnamurthy, whose clinic I visited yesterday, for his hospitality and for his support of neuropsychiatry. And I'm very proud to be here and honor the memory of Mr. Arunachalam and the many things that he was interested in and inspired in this field. The subject that I will talk about is of interest to all of us who are parents and grandparents, and we think about it throughout most of our lives. And I'm going to talk about some of the scientific developments over the last 20 years, many of which have been a surprise to me. And perhaps they will be a surprise to you, and perhaps at the end of my talk, you'll say, well, we all knew it all along anyway, and that's fine too. So I want to say first about measurement, what I mean by why children turn out the way they do. When you change it into a scientific question, part of that question is, what is our children's personality? And I'll talk just a bit about the measurement of personality, and with questionnaires and some other measures. And nowadays, these questionnaires are put into a computer, and you look for clusters of personality traits that have some validity, that go together. And especially we've looked at, we and other research groups have looked at what parts of personality might be genetic, might be inherited from our parents via our genes, and what aspects of personality might be caused by our parents' behavior toward us and our behavior toward our children and the way we raise them. And there are some aspects of what children do that are clearly not genetic. And you wouldn't even think of genetic, but can be a problem. So it might have a young girl who always falls in love with an older men in relationships that are not possible to be fulfilled, and that she gets stuck on this, and this causes problems in her life. That's not something genetic, clearly, and just, I won't be talking about it, but it's not something that we always can find the reason for. Or there might be a young man who always takes on himself projects that he can't finish, that are perhaps beyond his ability. He might have little musical ability, but decide he wants to be a musician, or he might decide that he wants to be an engineer, even though he doesn't have mathematical ability, and always take on things that he ends up failing. Well, that's not genetic. It could be something that maybe could be understood, and sometimes we can't understand it, but they're important aspects of personality, but you can't put them in the computer. The kind of personality traits that I want to talk about that you can put in the computer by taking many, many questions and putting them together and finding a cluster. All of the studies all over the world, including in India and Korea and North America, in Europe, in many different cultures, find clusters of 5 personality dimensions. And they're called the Big Five, if you study personality. And they come out in any personality test. Sometimes they have a different name. But one dimension, they call it neuroticism or anxiety or worry. And some people worry more and some people worry less. It's not always bad to worry more. These are dimensions of normal personality. Some people don't worry enough. Some people worry a lot, but it's good for them because they don't get into trouble. So within limits, how much you worry, how anxious you are, is a dimension of normal personality. Number 2, is there a way I can make a pointer here?
I think it's this one.
Okay.
It's the second one, yeah.
Number 2 is extroversion or introversion. Some people always like to be with other people, like to talk, like to smile, like to be at parties. If they have an extra evening, they want to go out. And some people or children prefer to stay at home, prefer to read, to be with their their family, be quiet in the corner, they're introverted. Introversion, extroversion is a personality dimension within normal personality that comes out as a way people and children differ everywhere in the world. There are variants on introversion, extroversion. Number 3 is a little bit harder for people not in the field to understand, but it is also a factor that comes out in all the personality tests as a cluster. It's called openness to experience, to new experiences. Some people, we used to call it novelty seeking, and that's how I got into this field, because I was interested in the dopamine D4 receptor gene, and it varies very much, that gene in people, and it relates to novelty seeking. So, but we have a more broad term for it now. We call it openness to new experiences. Some people always want something new. And they're looking for new things, and they're open to new things, new ideas, new feelings, new actions. Other people prefer to stay with what they have. And this is a normal personality dimension. A 4th personality dimension is called agreeableness. Some people, you ask them something, first they say no, then afterwards they can argue or discuss it. And some people prefer to say yes, and then afterwards they discuss it. But some people are more agreeable. Agreeableness goes along with altruism, like in the people that we've seen on the podium today, and who make things possible for other people out of their goodwill. Doing things for others is part of agreeableness. The 5th dimension is called conscientiousness. You could also say it's a little bit obsessiveness. Some people like to do their work, like to be orderly. You sometimes see a child of 3 years old ordering everything in a very orderly way, and another child will never keep his room clean. And people who are orderly tend to like to do their duty, and they see the world in terms of order and achievement and discipline, and other people are low on that trait. Well, these traits are all normal traits. And one way to study them that has been very important in the last 50 to 60 years has been twin studies. And so one can look at identical twins or fraternal twins. Identical twins are twins who were developed from the same fertilized egg in their mother's womb, and the egg after fertilization split, and they have all of their genes in common. They're genetically identical, and usually they grow up in the same family at the same time, and so they have both environment and genes in common. Fraternal twins occur when there are 2 eggs in the mother's womb, and 2 different sperm fertilize them, and the twins develop in the mother's womb and are born at the same time and grow up in the same family at the same time, but they are just brothers or sisters because they were from 2 different eggs and 2 different sperm. So you can compare many things on identical twins and fraternal twins. You can compare height. Height is almost always very, very similar in identical twins and less similar in fraternal twins. You can compare weight, similarly, much more similar and identical than in fraternal. And you can look at many traits, blood pressure, and you can look at personality. And you can also look at mental disorders. And I am not going to talk about mental disorders. I'm going to talk about personality and behavior in the normal range today. And you can look at those 5 personality dimensions in identical twins and in fraternal twins, and you can look at these dimensions in what we call a quantitative way, not yes or no, but measured from 100, 99, 98, how high they are on that score, and then you can look at how similar identical twins are to fraternal twins, and you can get something called a correlation. So I'm going to show here correlations, and these are just 4 major studies, and these are the average of the 4 major studies that all found the same thing. And basically, all 5 major personality variables are very inherited. What does very inherited mean? They're inherited with a correlation of 0.5. 0.5 means that 50% of the scale of the variance is inherited, and 50% is not. It's a very nice little summary that we have had for a while, and then I'm going to show you what problems we have with this scientific summary. When I started in this field 25, 30 years ago, I would tell people it's very nice. About half of our personality is due to our genes, and half is due to the way our parents raised us. So I felt very good about that. 35 years ago, I had 6 little children at home, and I knew that half of what they were was already determined from the genes of myself and my wife, and half we could change by what we did. And these figures, I think, are accepted by everyone and have been reviewed in many scientific reviews, and I could say it's a true fact. The correlation of the big 5 personality dimensions, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, and openness, is that the heritability is about 50%. And then what about the other 50%? We assumed it was the parents. And then came along a young psychologist, not so young, but relatively young, named Judith Harris. This is a wonderful book. I recommend it to all of you. And there are 2 main points. First of all, her personal story. She was a PhD candidate at Harvard, and she was thrown out. She was thrown out because they said that her ideas would never come to anything. She wasn't a good researcher. She was thrown out. And she married a psychologist. She had 2 children. Actually, she had a child and adopted a child. And she also developed multiple sclerosis and became wheelchair-bound. And you can read about her in several places, and she continued her research. When she started, there wasn't an internet, but the local librarian would help her find articles. And the first thing that she was interested in is she reviewed all of the psychological literature about child raising. And there, of course, you could fill this room with articles. And just as an example of what she reviewed, let's say if a parent punishes a child physically, or the children are slightly more likely to hit other children. If a child is hit, it's more likely to hit other children, you could say. And the correlation is about 0.2 or 0.3, not a big correlation, but it is definitely there. And what she said is that those authors, those scientists, did not take into account that perhaps it isn't the parents hitting the child that makes the child hit. Maybe the child inherited from the parent a tendency toward hitting, and that it isn't something that the child learned, it's an expression of the same genetic personality trait. Or another example would be that if a mother is sad and might have also some particular sadness after childbirth and might not be very involved with her child, there would be a likelihood, there is a likelihood, there have been many papers that there's a likelihood that the child might also grow up feeling sadness, feeling not taken care of, might have problems taking care, if it's a female child, her own children. Well, Judith Harris said, that's true, but is it really the mother's lack of care that caused the daughter to feel abandoned? Maybe the mother had a tendency toward toward that personality trait, which the daughter inherited, and what they have in common is the gene, not that the mother's behavior influenced the child. And this, of course, is very, very important in treatment to decide. It might be that actually a child who is born to a mother who tends to be sad or less conscientious doesn't need more conscientious care. Maybe the opposite would help. And so we need to know whether things... Well, Ruth Harris summarized her critique of the literature, and that the whole literature on parent-child behavioral correlations did not take into account the 50% that is genetic, and that just assumed that measuring behavior in parents and looking at a cause in children, that the relationship was causal. And she sent it in for publication. She was in a wheelchair because of multiple sclerosis. And it became a prize paper in the Psychological Bulletin, which is one of the most prestigious papers in the field of psychology. It received a major prize, and the person who gave her the prize was the professor of psychology who had thrown her out of her doctoral studies. So she had a sweet revenge. But what she did then is stimulate a whole new field of trying to find out what part of the correlations between behavior of parents and children, in particular cases, is genetic or not, and raising the question that we clinicians always need to ask when we see a child with a problem or with a personality trait, and a parent with a personality trait and a problem. Did the parent in any sense cause the problem in the child, or did both of them just inherit something that neither of them are guilty for, and that the particular behaviors that the parent might need to change are not necessarily the obvious ones? Well, how has this field progressed? And it has progressed with a huge leap due to studies that came out of Minnesota that we're able for the first time in these last 20 years to look at monozygotic twins, identical twins and fraternal twins, not that had grown up together in the same household, but that were adopted away and raised apart, usually for one of two reasons. Either that the parents died in an automobile accident and the children, the twins, were given away to different homes, or that the twins were born out of wedlock, that the mother was not married, and so that the twins, and she did not want to raise them, were raised elsewhere. And so this kind of twin adoption study was done by a group. It's a very expensive study in a very large country, and they found over 100, 200 pairs of identical and fraternal twins that had been raised apart. And I want to just tell you a little bit about the different models. Let's see how my time is going. I'm okay for time. About the different models that we could conceive of in this kind of twin study. And so in twin studies, if you, in general, whether they're raised together, if these bars here represent 4 different situations. The yellow relates to identical twins and the green to fraternal twins. And these are the correlations. A perfect correlation is 1 and no correlation at all is 0. If identical twins and fraternal twins are not alike at all on a particular trait, psychological or physical, well, it means that there's no effect of genes, but also no effect of the family environment. If nothing, we don't have any causes. If twins who grow up in the same household are correlated 0.5, but identical twins and fraternal twins are correlated the same degree, well, that means it's all the family environment. The genes didn't have any effect. If twins that grew up in the same household, the identical twins are more correlated than the fraternal twins, there's a big difference, well, this difference shows the effect of genes. But if the identical twins that grew up in the same household are not perfectly correlated, well, it means that the family environment isn't the whole story. There are things outside the family. And then a additional model that I think I'll just skip that. So what kinds of just to give you an example in studies of intelligence as well, because in the studies of intelligence, this is maybe I'll go on, it'll be easy, I'll go right to personality, and then I can come back to that. So in the Bouchard, Minnesota study of twins that identical and fraternal twins that had been reared apart, there were 217 twin pairs, identical twin pairs that had been reared apart, not by their family, and 100 fraternal reared together twins, and then 200 identical reared together twins, and 100 fraternal reared together twins, and then 44 identical reared apart twins, and 27 identical reared apart, 27 fraternal reared apart twins. You'll see these numbers so that it doesn't matter if I've stumbled there. These numbers have since actually been replicated elsewhere, because the big surprise is, as I'll show you, that it doesn't matter whether identical twins or fraternal twins are reared apart or reared by their own family. We can find the genetic effects, but we are not able to identify effects of the family. This is a big blow to our self-image as parents, but on the other hand, we will try, as I will show later in the talk, to make the best of us. This also relieves us a bit of the guilt for how our kids turn out, because it's hard to find any effect of parental rearing on behavior other than the genes we pass on to them. And I'll show this a little bit more detail, but this is just the summary, a wonderful summary, and that it has been repeated this way now many times. Contrary to widely held beliefs, the overall contribution of the common environment component of family was small and negligible for almost all of the personality variations that we can measure. To show you these numbers a little bit. So this MZA is monozygotic apart, identical twins reared apart. DZA is dizygotic, fraternal twins reared apart. MZT is identical twins reared together. And DZT is dizygotic twins reared together. So let's just look at a whole bunch of personality variables, including the big five that I told you about, and more recently looking at other constructs, however we want to look at it. You always find identical twins reared apart, correlated in their personality and behavioral variables about 0.5, about 50%. Monozygotic twins reared together, you'd expect would be much higher than this. You'd expect that you'd have all of the common genes in common and all of the effects of environment in common. But if you compare this column and this column, there is almost no increase in similarity from being reared together compared to being reared apart. An identical twin is 50% on almost every variable alike to his identical twin, whom he may have not seen his whole life, but he's no more similar to his identical twin that he was reared together with as his own family. If you look at fraternal twins, they are much reared apart. They are much less similar. They are similar like any brothers or sisters, much less similar than identical twins. And then if you look at fraternal twins reared together, they are also much less similar than identical twins, but no more similar than fraternal twins reared apart, who might not have seen each other their whole life. And then there are calculations that one can do comparing identical twins to fraternal twins reared apart, and you can show that the difference relates to the additional genetic similarity of being identical rather than fraternal. And you can do the same calculation in twins reared together in the same family, and you find the same genes affecting it. But then if you compare reared together versus reared apart, you can't find any effect of being reared together. So there is now the technical term that we use, It's called shared familial variance. So when we are studying now the personality development of children, we know that there are genetic factors, things that are passed in the sperm and the egg by genes and by DNA. And then we have a construct called familial, and then the rest that's not genetic is environmental. That's clear. The genetic studies have proven that not all is genetic. Only 50% is genetic. But the part that's not genetic, that we always assumed was the family, we can't find the family. What is it? Well, just to show it statistically, the part that would, so everything that's genetic, all of these traits, they're all about 0.5. They all come out about, I can't show it on that slide there, but they're all here under genetic, about 0.5. And that's true for almost anything, any personality trait that can be measured quantitatively. What about shared familial? Shared familial would be the difference between the identical twins reared together and reared apart. And that is close to 0. And what remains, it's called unshared environmental variance. It's factors in child development that are not genetic, but are not from the family. What could they be? And so we in the large sense in the world have been actively trying to find these variables these last few years, and the truth is we haven't really found them. What could they be? They could be a friend that a child makes at age 9 and has a great influence on him. It could be a particular teacher that the child really likes and wants to imitate. It could be other aspects of the peer group, the friends. Non-genetic, but not in the family. It could be things the child sees on television. Not some things, or in the movies. It seems that there are factors that are affecting children, one child differently from another in the family. Things that are not in their genes, but are not part of the common familial environment. And if you think about it a little bit evolutionarily, it can make a bit of sense. Children were not designed to live in the world of their parents. Our ancestors, when we evolved as human beings on this earth, were not an environment that changed at the rate of technology today. But it would be wrong to think that they were always in the same environment. The opposite. My daughter is an anthropologist, and she always emphasizes to me that we succeeded as human beings during times when climate was changing from savanna to forest and back again, when rainfall was changing, our social structure was always changing. We could sometimes needed to live in big groups and small groups depending on whether the animals available to hunt were big animals or whether we had to live by collecting nuts, and human beings can survive on a large variety of diets. And we like to think that we learn a lot from our parents, but really, our parents can only teach us about their world. No one knows what the future can bring, but it is closer to the future to learn from other children and your peers. And it might be that children were really designed not to listen to their parents too much, because parents can't give them, by and large, really good advice about what the future is going to bring. We think we're giving them good advice, but in terms of their evolutionary fitness for their world, it might be that they're designed really to learn from their peers, and that what we can perhaps sometimes do for them is to make sure that they have access to positive peers and positive influences and positive television and positive movies, because direct imitation and advice does not seem to be the mechanism. And I'll just give you an example for a minute from the realm of investigation that was the subject of my first talk this morning, the bilingualism and linguistics, because Judy Harris, in that book that I recommended on nature and nurture, also makes a big point of this in terms of immigration and change of countries. When families move to a new language zone, of course it takes a while for the adults and for the children to learn the new language. The parents who learn the new language at an adult age will always speak with an accent. If it is not a language they learned before puberty, they will always have an accent. Children will, before the age of puberty, will learn the new language without an accent. Well, what studies have done is to look at children who are at home with their parents in the new country more than 22 hours a day. They're only hear the new language 2 hours a day, and they hear their parents speaking the new language with an accent all the rest of the day. The children speak the new language without an accent. They give a preference. Their brain prefers speaking the way the other children speak, not the way their mother and father speaks. Because if they did, they'd always have the accent of their mother and father. And they don't. Within months, they speak the new language. So they are programmed to prefer learning from their peers, from the group that they see represents the future, not from people that might have succeeded and might want to give them a lot, but who they somehow feel it's not the right advice for my succeeding in the future. So that this is the state of the science today. We clearly identify genetic factors as being responsible for about 50% of most normal personality traits in children, and it is a key factor in psychotherapy to accept that. So that many parents come to me and they're worried, my child wants to stay at home and read. And when I was a child, I also stayed at home and read, but when I grew up, I always envied children who went out and played basketball and they belonged to the clubs, and I want to make my child also want to play basketball and go to clubs, and sometimes, often, we want to make our children into what we are jealous of and what we would have wanted to be but are not. But there is a high likelihood that our children have inherited our genes, and my answer to such a parent is that you have a wonderful child, and if he prefers to be at home and to be introverted, that's fine. That turned out fine with you. And a flower, if you take a bulb and you buy a bulb at the store, and you don't know what color that tulip is going to turn out. You can't see it on the bulb. When you plant it, it's your job as a parent to give it water and to give it sunlight and to put it in good soil. But there isn't anything you can do, Mom and Dad, to make it come out red or yellow. That's just in there, in that bulb. And I say to that parent, your child, he prefers to be at home, that's fine. Most important thing would be for you to accept that. Or another child might be the opposite. His parents might have been active and involved with friends and clubs and didn't study much, and they want their son to study more and go to school, and he doesn't want to. And I advise most of the time, try to accept him the way he is and the way he seems to be. And actually, I find most parent-child difficulties occur when, because genetics, it's only 50%, and there's also a lot of something I probably won't try to explain today, called independent assortment. So you may remember from Mendel's P's and genetics that there are recessive things and there are things that come out that are not expected but that can still be part of the genetic predisposition. And I find that often parent-child problems derive from situations where the parents, the child is just not the way his parents expect or dream him to be, and that renaming and cognitive reframing and accepting the good points of different patterns of behavior is extremely important. In those personality traits, inherited personality traits that I enumerated at the beginning, within very, very wide limits, these are all normal. So people can be very extroverted and normal, and people can be very introverted and normal. People can be very novelty-seeking and normal, and people can be very much want everything to stay the same, low novelty-seeking and normal. People can be high on anxiety, neuroticism, and normal, and they're careful, very careful people, not risk takers, and people can be very low on neuroticism, anxiety, and always have a lot of confidence, and that can be normal. However, in understanding psychopathology, it is important to think that there may be some combinations that are problematic. So most things within the normal dimensions we should accept, but sometimes someone inherits a tendency for very high novelty seeking, but also a tendency for high neuroticism, anxiety. Well, he's going to be in a conflict. And I'm talking at a genetic level. Freud talked about conflicts at the psychological level. But people can inherit genetic tendencies that are somehow don't fit together well. And then it's the role of the physician and the therapist to help the parents actually work with the child to tone down one of those two tendencies if they are not going together. I think it is important for us all to be skeptical. I think Judith Harris did a great service to us about simplistic studies that show parent-child correlations and assume causality. That if parents are this way, then their children turned out that way. It might be that that's the case, but it might not be that the way the parents were caused that, but that they just inherited the same tendency. So one thing that is important to know, we always in science talk about the limitations of our science. Anyone who tells you, who's a scientist, that he's absolutely sure, then don't believe him. And one thing that's important to know about all of these studies in personality, in twins especially, is that they are limited in the range of socioeconomic class and intelligence, so that people who are very, very limited in intelligence or extreme in personality were excluded from the study. Any children who had had psychiatric abnormalities are not in the study. So when we say that parents don't really have an effect, we mean within the normal limits. If a parent is an extreme in abandoning a child or in being violent toward a child or not exposing a child to adequate education, this is bad. This can damage a child. There is nothing in the studies that I'm telling you to say that a parent doesn't have to do his job as being a parent. If you have a flower, a bulb, it needs water, it needs sun, it needs earth. What I'm saying is that when it comes to how kids turn out the way they do, most of it is them and their genes and factors that we don't completely understand, and that the best investigators in the field now have said that the environmental influences are so complex that they will probably remain outside of the domain of systematic scientific investigation for a long time. We don't have a handle yet on proofs of how we should raise children. One thing, though, is I think we shouldn't feel guilty. It's mostly not us in terms of how they turn out. They turn out the way they do, half because of the genes they gave them, and half because of friends, environment, television, the way society is, or for reasons that we don't have a understanding of. So I think I'll stop here. Does that sound okay to you? And I won't go on to the Flynn effect. Good. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. We request Dr. E.S. Krishnamurthy to coordinate the question and answer session.
Do sit down and take questions. There's a mic there. I'm sure you feel very enlightened having listened to that, perhaps somewhat relieved. Maybe some of you are slightly disappointed, but I'm sure you all have questions. So I'm going to open this out for people to ask a question. Please say who you are before you ask the question, and we'll take about 5 questions to begin with, and then we'll see how we're doing for time.
Dr. Belmaker. I am Ranganathan, retired Deputy General Manager from State Bank of India. Do you think what is the studies done on twin applicable to non-twins also? And we have a saying, show the book a child reads, show me his friends, we will predict his future. That is a saying in our thing. That is true, as per your study also. And is there a relation between creativity and bringing up or genes?
Thank you,
Any
sir.
study has been done?
Thank you. Request you to keep it to one question.
Very good questions. From all we can tell, and the question has been studied forwards and backwards, for almost everything, twins are good representatives of the general population. Of course, you look at things like their birth weight and their other developmental milestones, and the mean, the average on each of the personality measures, and compare it to the general population. And there are now a couple of adoption studies as well that find the same thing, so that that's one of the sides that I skipped. Can you hear now? Yeah. That adopted children, for the first year or two in infancy, there's a major effect of how the parents take care of them on their measures of personality and activity. That correlation rapidly declines to zero on most measures, and that there is the contribution of their biological parents, the genes, and then unknown factors as they begin to leave the home and have peer groups, but that we really don't completely understand. With regard to creativity, not too much is known, in my opinion, about especially extremes of creativity. There have been several series published in the psychological literature of Nobel Prize winners or extremely creative people, and they do pop up often, like Ramanujan, not too far from here, without any signs of its happening. There are some families, as you know, like the Huxley family, that have had several geniuses over the course of 2 or 3 generations. But even in those families, not everyone is a genius. And clearly, musical creativity is a separate dimension. It's not related to overall intelligence, nor to any other personality dimension that I reported as being studied. To some extent, mechanical ability is also an independent human dimension that some people are good in, and unrelated to general intelligence, which is also general intelligence. I didn't show you the data, is unrelated to any of the other dimensions of personality. So there are very smart people who are very stubborn and not very agreeable, and there are people with limited intelligence who can be great extroverts and very successful in life if they use their personality correctly. But so I think that would be stretching the limit of what I would be able to say about creativity, which is a great mystery.
Thank you, Professor. Yes, sir. Somebody has the mic already, so.
One small comment I appreciate. The important day, I wish you all is a good Friends Day, because it's the International Friends Day. Please accept my wishes. One important thing as a parent and children, never be an advisor to them. We can only give suggestions. The real sense, you narrow the generation gap in such a way, you be an eye lead for the children, never become an eye for them. It is their vision they must live, as you was telling very correctly. So no question of instructing, dictating like that. No children will listen to you. I appreciate. I will ask you only one question. How many years a generation is? Can you tell me one generation is how many years? 25, 33, whatever thing. What do you say, Krishnamurthy? How many years a generation is?
10 years in 2016, sir.
Okay, excellent. One generation means the birth of your year and birth of your child, the gap is the generation. You want to lessen the generation gap, be a friend to your children, never be really a parent. I appreciate what he has been telling. Thank you,
sir. Thank you, sir. I saw a couple of hands go up, one here and one behind.
I'm Dr. Sugathan, a clinical psychologist from Kerala. It's not a question, it's a small information. We have a Cholamandal artist village, and that is the second in the world. And there, what we have seen is the children of artists, very few are going through that path.
Inclined to art.
Most of them are not artists. So that shows creativity, even with genetics. It is not transmitted in a younger generation. There may be a peer group pressure. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
My name is Natarajan. I request you to say a few words on child prodigy. A second topic that I also wish to quickly ask you is, has there been no progress from the publication of 2000? You talked about Turkheimer and Waldron. If you can throw some light on that. Thank you.
So in terms of no progress, I think there are a lot of negative reports, a lot of hypotheses about what might be the critical familial influence that we haven't found. There have been some studies trying to identify whether school, choice of school, is the critical thing. There was a promising study or two that I don't think is replicated, and that would be very important because some people have said that a person should make a huge financial element to send his children to a better school, and it would be a practical piece of advice. Neighborhoods, getting into people in bad neighborhoods are a difficult thing for children, and there have been some publications that if a child is sent to a different school rather than in his bad neighborhood where the parents live, that he might have a better outcome. I don't think these studies are clear and repetitive enough to say that this is always the right thing, and I think we want to avoid the kind of, to be very careful about the kind of social engineering that was done in Australia, as you know, when the children of the native Australians were taken away from their parents, who were considered to be in bad neighborhoods, and sent to boarding schools with European Australians to turn out better, and it didn't work well for those children. So we would need to be very sure of what the intervention would be, and I think the story with intelligence, which I didn't present, but in a way is parallel to the story of personality. It can be instructive. Intelligence is highly heritable. There's a lot of heritable factors, but the model is not the model of heritability in biology. The true model, I have some slides about this, but I'll summarize them, is not the model of the Indian caste system where, you know, the children of a Brahmin are always a Brahmin and the children of a untouchable are always an untouchable. The model of genetics is if there is a genetic influence, the children are likely to be like their parents, but that there are many who will not be because of independent assortment of genes. And so what will often come to my attention is a young boy who's It was in first grade, and he's not doing so well, and both of his parents are doctors, and they're very disappointed, and he spends a year with a psychologist, and it doesn't change, and in second grade, he's still getting average grades, and they change psychologists, and in the third grade, he's spending all of his time on soccer, and they change him to another psychologist, and there are a lot of arguments at home, and the father is angry with him, and he's rebellious because he doesn't know what the parents want. And then they come to me, and I send the child for a full intelligence testing. And it comes back, and I call the parents in, and I say, you know, doctor, you have a wonderful young child, and he's a great soccer player, and he's handsome, and he's sociable, and I like him so much, but he is not going to go to medical school. He has average intelligence, and you are going to have to accept him the way he is, because that is not going to change no matter how many private tutors you get for him. And I have found that realistic advice based on genetics has helped more people often than many years of psychological counseling based on the communist idea that a child is a tabula rasa and can be changed by the environment according to the will of the therapist or physician. I don't think that that idea of being able to change anyone by environment led to good results for the human race. So the idea that everything is genetic has also been a disaster for the human race. I think the therapeutic approach is to accept what we cannot change and to try to change what we can and to ask God for the wisdom to know the difference. And
Thank you, Professor. I'll just take two more questions. We are running short of time. The lady, the people who have the mics, I'll go the lady first.
Yeah. I'm Vasanthi. I'm an educationist. And my question to you, Dr. Belmaker, is, granted that we cannot change heredity, granted that the familial factors are also not really going to make much of a difference, then is there any way, or have there been any studies which will tell us as if these are the personality factors, if you can take the personality factors and map a child, are there any studies to show what kind of professions or courses that a child can be channelized into? Maybe the parent, if there is that awareness, maybe something meaningful could come out of it. So I just want to...
Thank you.
I think that's an excellent question, and I think that that counseling model of fitting people to who they are and helping them to be who they are is a right and effective model, rather than the model of encouraging people to be what they are not. So I'm not an expert in the counseling studies, but I'm sure there is a large literature on the effectiveness of counseling. Psychotherapy also is effective. I think it is more effective when it takes individual nature into account.
So we'll take a last question.
My question is, when parents are facing problem with the children or having guilt out of the performance not coming to their expectations, and we are talking about nature and nurture and the environment, they suddenly decide to change out of guilt or out of ambition to perform them better or develop a better personality, put them into a boarding school and the influence of the boarding school on their performance and their development of personality. Because we are talking about the peers, the peer group changes suddenly from one environment to the other, and even the parenting would change in the boarding school, because they would have a different disciplining authorities rather than the parents that they had at home. And many times it works wonderfully, but there are other times when it is a disaster and the child goes into worse. What is the opinion about this particular?
Thank you.
I agree with you entirely that sometimes a radical change of the environment is helpful and sometimes it's a disaster. And we somehow need to take both of those outcomes into account when we make our life decisions, because we don't have good predictive tools yet. And in medicine, we tend to follow the rule of primum non nocere, first do no harm, and we try not to make very risky recommendations. But on the other hand, in life, sometimes things become impossible and you have to take a risk. But I think it is important when one does, that one does it with a heavy heart and not to be sure, but to be tentative. And sometimes you have to take a brave risk and send a problem child to a boarding school because the family situation is impossible. But it's exactly as you say, we don't have the good predictor yet of when it's going to work.
Thank you, Professor Belmaker. I think we should do that during lunchtime. My father taught me that there are 3 qualities for a chairman: firm, firmer, and firmest. So I apologize, but we can talk during lunch. We live in the social media world. And I don't know if any of you have been on social media while you're here, but there are a few tweets from @Neurokrish and @BrainyOwl. So I'm going to summarize his talk as a series of tweets. Okay, because in psychology, there is the primacy and the recency effect. And the recency effect is to tell you 4 quotes from Professor Belmaker. The first thing was, twins reared together are not that different from twins reared apart. So it may be more nature than nurture. Okay. The second, children were not designed to listen to their parents. They were designed to listen to their peers. The third, children speak a new language without an accent if they've learnt it early on in life. An adult who learns a new language always speaks it with an accent. And therefore, you can take this as further proof that it's more nature than nurture. And early genetic influences are important. And the fourth, that people inherit some genetic personality traits sometimes that don't sit well together. And I liked what Professor Belmaker prescribed. It's not just, ask them to learn to live with it. You have to work with them, and you have to work with the family. And I think all the questions here today, and I think the wonderful turnout also indicates how concerned we are about our children and how we want to do our best for them. The other thing I asked a friend who came in, why did you not bring your parents? Because I am sure they want to know why you turned out the way you did. My parents are wondering all the time. So with those words, I get the pleasant duty of saying thank you. I'd like to start by saying thank you to Professor and Mrs. Belmaker, who have traveled all the way from Israel and spent a few wonderful days with us. Thank you so much for being here. Please give them a big hand. I'd like to thank the Vellayan Chettiar Trust, the family of Sri M.V. Arunachalam, Mr. M.V. Murukappan, our president of the function today, Mr. A. Vellayan, and their team for supporting this activity, for supporting other charitable activities linked to it. And I think without them, there would be no program. Please give them a very big hand. I would like to say a very special hello to my friend Mrs. M.V. Arunachalam, who's there in the front row. She blesses the program every year. I'd like to thank all the organizations that have been involved, our Neurokrish and TriMed team, of course, but we've had the Indian Medical Association represented by Dr. Prem Kumar Satya here, and many doctors have taken part today. I'd like to thank the Institute of Neurological Sciences, VHS, Dr. Vijay Kumar, the current director is here today. And I'd like to thank the Professor Belmaker for allowing us to have the International Neuropsychiatry Association represented. This is a curtain riser to our International Congress in 2018, and we hope there'll be other curtain risers before the International Congress happens in February 2018 in Nimans, Bangalore. So those of you who are interested, please watch that space. I'd like to thank all the other people involved in organizing the program, Marandeshwara Enterprises, the press who are here in a very large attendance, and I'm sure they'll carry this message to the world. I'd like to thank the delegates who've come from different parts of India. We've heard some of them ask questions today. I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time off, and if I have missed anyone out in saying thank you, please accept this as thank you. Thank you very much. Please join us for lunch.